Hi, I'm Jeremy Kirk with Intel 471, and this is Studio 471, our regular monthly podcast on cybersecurity and cyber threat intelligence. Many enterprises use deception techniques, and these involve various ways to manipulate adversaries, whether it's trapping them in frustrating loops or baiting them with fake resources. Tim Pappa is a former FBI supervisory special agent, and he specializes in deception techniques. And he's here today to talk about how enterprises can get threat intelligence out of these techniques and also how to implement them. Thanks for coming along, Tim.
Yeah, thank you, Jeremy. Happy to be here.
So you worked for more than 15 years for the FBI. Tell us about your
Mhm.
background and what you did there.
Sure. Yeah, I was a special agent and then a supervisory special agent in counterintelligence and in cyber. But probably the most relevant focus related to cyber deception was my last half dozen years in the FBI. I was a profiler with the behavioral analysis unit. And that unit I was on specifically focused on cyber attackers. But there's an aspect of that as well where we would also do consultations related to cyber deception strategies, which at the time, this is like 2018, 2019, that was a newer thing for sure in the FBI. And it's still a rare thing today in government and in industry.
And so let's talk about the origins of cyber deception. Like, what's its heritage and how did it come about?
Yeah. A lot of people will point to a book by Clifford Stoll back in the 80s, I believe. And, he actually set up a honeypot to catch at the time, I think a Russian state actor that was in a government network. And I think it's called the Cuckoo's Egg, right? So that a
It's on the
lot.
shelf. It's on the
Oh, it
shelf,
is.
actually, if I can
Okay.
put my finger on it right there, I think.
Yeah. A lot of people point to that. I mean, that's a great example of cyber deception because it does reflect a lot of those aspects of deception that are so dynamic, right? Where we're talking about curiosity and creativity and not just what you build on a network, not just infrastructure or techniques, but how you think about that attacker or that person you're trying to catch, how they're thinking about things, what they're feeling, all those things matter. And so with Clifford's example, obviously he's thinking about what's motivating this unknown attacker to go over here, over here. I'm going to build something that's behaviorally responsive to them. So generally speaking, if you look at like the history of deception, of course, deception's been around since the beginning of time, basically. If you step outside of, everyday examples of it, a lot of the research and literature is in a military space. I mean, most people will talk about that, right? Like World War II or the Ghost Army or having inflatable tanks. That's all part of that history. Now, cyber deception, though, moving beyond Clifford Stoll's example, if I had to really kind of shrink that down, if my experience coming into industry from the FBI about 2 years ago, I think is similar to a lot of people's, which is when you talk about cyber deception, what do you mean? A lot of people think of active defense. And someone like John Strand with Black Hills, I mean, he was a major figure in that space of encouraging and pushing that kind of idea. And when I joined Walmart, that book was shared with me, and I hadn't read it before. So it's like, people don't have to be so well versed in all of this research and literature, but generally people are pretty familiar with this whole idea of deceiving someone else. So yeah, in its plainest form, sure, cyber deception is an online version of deception, but from my experience, it's a richer environment actually to demonstrate deception because you don't just have that human element, but you have that technical and digital element as well. I think, though, cyber deception continues to develop and grow and change. And from my perspective, I think this is a very timely moment because if you look ahead like 5 or 10 years, I think this is going to be a staple of many organizations' InfoSec programs. There's going to be a deception element. There's still a lot of companies that do deception a little bit here and there, but they don't necessarily have traditionally defined teams that are just for that. That's a rare thing. And I think even my experience in law enforcement at the FBI and the intelligence community, it was still a rare thing. which is surprising because if you look at um, some of the seminal scholars in the space, and Barton Whaley is definitely one of them. A lot of people talk about his deception framework with Bell back in the early 80s, simulation and dissimulation. People refer to it all the time. I use it all the time when I was at the FBI, and even now in industry, that is that foundation for designing deception. But you look at some of his works, and his works have been preserved in these libraries in the intelligence community for many years at the CIA and then later at National Intelligence University. And I don't know, I never was quite sure what to make of it when I would go to the special collections rooms with
Yeah.
Barton Willie's works, and nobody was really in there. Here's how I kind of put it. I've been around the block, right, in the intelligence community, in the law enforcement community, and using deception just wasn't a common theme. I mean, people can call
Yeah.
it other things like ruses and other things, but using it online for adversary engagement and using it for designing infrastructure for a deceptive purpose, it's always been a rare thing.
And
And the
so
same goes with industry.
I think a lot of people think of deception as honeypots, right? But it
Sure.
goes a lot deeper than this, doesn't it? Can you talk about some different examples of ways that people are implementing, I guess, deception today, to gain knowledge about adversaries?
Yeah, sure. No, honeypots are a great example because you're talking about a simulation, right? And people can usually understand that. A simulation that's going to attract an attacker and it's going to collect information on them, and the attacker thinks maybe it's a an actual vulnerable system. But there's so many other ways you can take a deception function like that and break in the smaller pieces. It could be a document, right? Like a honey document, right? That seems like it's a real document. It might be a document of interest with data that an attacker wants, but if they click on it or try to take it, there's some kind of alerting. I mean, that's a form of deception, right? Using false personas or sock puppets online to appear to be an employee of a company who might have information an attacker wants. That's deception. And of course, this goes both ways, right? Like an attacker socially engineering somebody masquerading as someone who appears to be a representative of a company or an employee, calling to update their account with credentials they've stolen. There's deception there. So yeah, the terms can get messy at times, but if you really had to break it down to what are we talking about with cyber deception? I mean, those root definitions of deception are you want to create erroneous decision making in your adversary, in your target,
Mm,
right?
yeah.
And that so that they will make a decision for your benefit. What I would emphasize though with deception and cyber deception, of course, as well, is you're looking for some kind of behavioral outcome. You don't want them to just think and feel something. You want them to do something
Mm.
to your advantage, right? So this is where it becomes much more holistic and rich in behavior than people usually give it credit for. So yeah, you do see definitely an increase in the last 5 years, not just in like university research, but even in industry of thinking about the cognitive vulnerabilities of attackers. That's a step in the right direction, right? But
Yeah.
we're still talking about what people think and feel when they encounter something they think might be deceptive. How does it change their decision making? And that's one way that deception could be very effective. So it isn't always about artifacts or infrastructure or content. It can be about perceptions of strength on a network or even weakness that could influence what an attacker decides to do, right?
And what
So
tools they
there's a,
use. Yeah. Yeah. And what
yeah,
tools may be riskier for them to use because it could reveal some of their TTPs or other
yeah,
technical data of their, infrastructure.
yeah. I think looking at this from like the lens of a researcher or a cyber threat intelligence researcher, what's been surprising to me in the past couple of years when I've done some of my own research outside of the FBI, if I look at something from the lens of cyber deception, like there's a Black Hat Asia presentation I did last year on a defunct group out of Indonesia called Muslim Cyber Army. And there had been a lot of reporting on them going back to like 2018, even before that. And they were always kind of characterized as like a hacktivist group or maybe a cyber criminal group, but they were involved in like trolling people and encouraging people to do violent things. And it was a big deal in Indonesia back then. But when I looked at them in terms of like what kind of deception techniques do they appear to be using years ago, no one had really done that before. And what I found from that analysis is, as far as I knew, this small collective of maybe a half dozen people who are kind of at the center of this, as far as I knew, they'd never been trained in deception, but literally everything they did was a demonstration of a different deception technique that you would find in the Bell-Whaley framework,
Wow.
which to me was a different perspective, right? Because I can look at it, their TTPs, I can look at their victims, and there can be some kind of assessment of that in terms of like their capability, their threat level, if I'm looking at it from a CTI lens. But when I also look at it from a deception and an analytical framework, it also gives me another perspective because without really using any tools, they were highly effective because they used deception to trick people, to cause erroneous decision making in populations they were trying to influence to move against the communities they didn't like. And so there was
And
another
do you reckon they had
demonstration
no
of
knowledge of
deception.
that framework that you're discussing, that
As
they
far as I
developed
knew,
this?
no.
Yeah, yeah.
Right? And I think that also starts to lead to anytime you look at the behavioral aspects of an attacker as well. Obviously, very difficult thing to do in CTI anyway, because there's so many unknowns. But I think that was the value as a profiler at the behavioral analysis unit. Our approach was always meant to be behaviorally based because that's when you start to separate out some of that speculation and conjecture. Like, what have we actually seen demonstrated? What have we actually observed? Then you start to see different motivations. So in a space where you example Muslim Cyber Army where they weren't really using any tools at all, but they were using deception. And then we didn't know much about the dynamics of this small collective of people. It changes the whole perspective on them. Like instead of it being some hacktivist group that's assessed to have like a much more threatening capability than they actually had. You could let it look at it from another perspective. No one's really taken deception frameworks and applied them to historical cyber threat case studies.
Yeah.
I wonder if we would have some different analytical outcomes. I don't know. It's something I've tried to encourage because most of our examples are typically like Russia-based cyber criminal groups. So taking an Indonesian group, that's unusual, and then taking a different framework, like a deception framework, if we use that, do we assess them differently? Do we characterize their threat capability differently? I think we do in a
Yeah.
lot of situations. So I think there's definitely a way to make CTI as a practice even more dynamic if you look at it through a deception lens.
Yeah, yeah. I want to talk a little bit about sort of, I guess, automation too, of
Mhm.
what you've described also seems like it's very kind of sort of human heavy, I guess, in a way too. I mean, how much does automation play a role in deception techniques? And is it kind of like set and forget systems, or how much nurturing and tending do these programs need if you wanted to set one up?
Sure. I think there's two considerations for automation. I think number one, I think automation is always that far off goal than anything you set up, right? Because there are going to be limits as something grows exponentially, potentially, to manual investigation, manual detection, manual analysis. That's going to be difficult, especially in a very large enterprise environment. But even for a small organization that may only have one or two people, that's going to become difficult. So I think that's always the goal is can you create a deception scenario that has content or artifacts, some kind of process for high fidelity alerting, and then automate that process. I think that can be simple enough for a lot of organizations. I've found so far since I've been in industry the past 2 years, sometimes the best deception is the most simple
Yeah,
deception where
yeah.
it's like, who's most likely to be in this space looking for this thing? An attacker, not someone using this service.
Yeah.
And so can we tie that to alerting? And then for a SOC or an IR, even if there's one IR defender, if it's high fidelity, that's gold to them. I think the second consideration with automation is as people continue to use this more, and that might be their goal, and there might be some element of software or platforms they use that have a lot of automation, that's important to remember in terms of how attackers might anticipate that. They might think that's normal, right? They might think it's normal that automation on a network looks like this. And so if there's an anticipation that your network topography and processes on your network look a certain way, well, that's an opportunity for simulation and dissimulation if you're thinking about it from a deception framework.
Yeah.
So again, it's not just person to person or attacker to defender. It also is that environment in terms of what they think is normal or not. Because an attacker is making those evaluations, right? Of
Yeah.
does this look normal or not? And so if they expect automation or you're trying to push a storyline and an
Yeah.
environment that we use automation, you can use that to your advantage for sure. Even if it's a situation where you want to give an impression to people doing reconnaissance or even attackers that do breach your network in some respect, that you're much more capable and stronger than they realize because you're using so much automation. So
Mm.
that can get complicated, but also can be very simple. So I think those would be the two main considerations with automation
I
and
was going to
deception.
ask, as far as attackers too, of like, are they cognizant frequently of like, oh, am I getting tricked here? Am I getting lured into something that's just a bit too easy? Does that happen?
It does. I mean, there's definitely like a limit to use cases that people in the industry can point to because one, you probably don't have enough people doing it, and two, people don't really want to share it. So there's that too. Same goes for government. I mean, there'd be even more silos, right, in terms of sharing what they've done. The public wouldn't really know. There are a lot of artificial studies out there with red teamers as approximate attackers, and that research in the past 5 years has consistently shown that, right? Like it's not just their decision making, but it's their pace and it's their level of confidence in trying to pull apart an artifact and if they think they're going in the right way. I mean, that's why some of these studies in the past 5+ years have consistently said, hey, even if you don't have deception, tell people you do. That will still be a deterrent with an
Right.
attacker,
And it's
right?
free,
And
right?
yeah, right. Especially if you think about deterrence and characterize it more as it's not preventing, but it is changing the nature of that interaction and the nature of an attacker's perception of your network, then that is deterrence because they're not quite sure. I mean, deception at its core is introducing uncertainty and ambiguity or introducing in greater certainty in something that is false. Can go either way, but that's what you're trying to do. So that's where it's beneficial to approach things that way. Now, in terms of like use cases, again, operationally, yeah, sometimes it's a situation where it's like maybe your deception approach is sound, but the attacker just hasn't seen it. And maybe
Yeah.
that's okay. I mean, I think speaking from my own experience too, there's a lot of trial and error and lessons learned. I mean, it's really at that stage. My impression has been that a lot of people in the industry are moving away from deception tech as their default approach with deception software. Um, because I think not only because there's a number of companies that have folded or been bought out, so there's only a few vendors left. But I think for a lot of people, really, they've found it hasn't worked as well as they've hoped. I mean, you're
Yeah.
talking about tripwires, passive artifacts, things that may not detect as well as some of the EDR tools. It's not behaviorally based. It's not focused on actual observed activity. A lot of times it's polluting networks. Now, that's not for everybody, but I've heard that again and again, those kind of stories. And so even in an industry space, our approach has been as much as possible, let's build our own stuff, let's customize, let's repurpose. But I think what makes it scalable, and I think whether you're a massive enterprise or you're a small organization is if you practice your cyber deception program or platform in response to actual activity you see, that I think that makes it scalable. Like I know
Yeah.
there are things that you're going to point to, like how you protect your users and your accounts, and you can count on like people are going to try and steal credentials and get in. Okay, you know that stuff's going to happen. However, if you can actually point to demonstrated observed behaviors and say, we're going to create something that's deceptive in nature and it's in response to this kind of activity targeting our network, I think that's what makes it scalable. And in that
Mm.
respect, that's where I think you don't really need the deception tech. They're just going to like throw things out there anyway. I know probably every deception tech company would argue me on that point and say, no, we make it customized. But that has not been my experience, and I think often many vendors struggle to respond to or provide the kind of gaps and requirements that we need in industry. So I don't know if that goes without saying for everyone else, but some of the companies I've talked to in industry that do have some deception element, oftentimes they just got to do it themselves, and I think that trend's going to continue.
That was one of my questions of because there's just, heaps and heaps and heaps of commercial solutions out there, and but there's also just a load of open source kind of frameworks and tools as well. So,
Mhm.
and you've kind of answered it already about what should organizations do? Should they go with a commercial provider, or should they just kind of roll their own, or is rolling their own too time intensive and it's better to get a commercial thing that does the specific bit that you want to do? But it seems like,
Sure.
yeah, it should be custom designed.
Yeah, I think your point about free resources out there is completely right on. I think there's just exponentially more than there was even a year ago.
Mm.
And there's so many simple ways to do that without having to purchase expensive software. Again, really, I think the difficult part with cyber deception in industry and enterprise that I did not have experience with in the FBI is building inside a network where you're going to have a lot of policies and procedures, right? And other equities. If it's just adversary engagement, that's another story, right? Because you're just
Mm.
engaging with someone online or trying to message something. Um, that is definitely a piece as well, I'd say that has seemed to be missing from a lot of organizations that are interested in deception or practicing deception. This whole idea of a deception narrative or deception storyline. Um, because if you're talking about even one false persona or a sock puppet or a whole platform, that's got to comport like technically and in real life.
Yeah.
And that storyline's got to comport with what an attacker is probably looking for in terms of ground truth on your network. And you can use that to your advantage. Again, if you go back to what are like low cost, even free ways to create a plausible, authentic looking deception approach? Well, you usually want to pull on real stories, right? What's happening out
Yeah.
there? What's happening with people in our company that makes this plausible that an attacker would be interested in? And can we create deception from that? So there is an aspect of creativity for sure in terms of trying to build off of something that's already true. That's where it happens more than anything, in my experience, not deception tools, right? It really hasn't been that deception tech. It's been let's use these techniques that we find in frameworks like the Bell-Whaley framework,
Yeah.
and we can even simplify it even like I think Chris Saunders wrote about intrusion detection honeypots, and he used the see, think, do model of like, what do you want them to see? What do you want the attacker to think? And what do you want them to do? Another emulation of Bell-Whaley deception framework, right? It's just making it more of a simple form, but we use all of that in terms of like our design thinking and how we approach what we do. At the end of the day, of course, in organizations, like, what's your value to me? It
Yeah.
probably comes down to like another layer of high fidelity alerts, right? That
Yeah.
protect an
Yeah.
organization. If no one else is detecting this, but this deception infrastructure or function does, then that's value for an organization.
And I guess another question is too is like how long should organizations kind of let it roll and be like, okay, I'm going to give you 6 months to try various things because it seems like it's something that takes time, right? And you're going to not have results necessarily, and you might have to keep trying. So is that kind of like one of the challenges of going, well, I want to see at the end of 6 months, yeah, like a list of high fidelity alerts and that kind of like follow on action that justifies allowing two people to, work on deception for maybe a third of their job or something like that.
Sure. I mean, I think realistically for an organization that wants a mature program, I do, from my own experience and from talking to some other companies, it would take a couple of years. I mean,
Yeah.
especially if you're starting from scratch, right? I mean, I think that's really the key point. Now, if you have people who have some level of experience, that can be accelerated. Of course, there are like very simple things right away. Someone could fork some program from GitHub and be like, we're going to use this. And they might have results from that. It kind of also depends on an organization's appetite for risk, right? Like
Yeah.
from day one when I was in industry, I told leadership, if you want to see immediate results, we could craft something this week and, put some kind of messaging and content on a dark web forum or market, and we will have a
Yeah.
response.
Yeah.
But
Yeah,
most organizations aren't
definitely.
willing to do that, right? It's
Yeah.
kind of like and
Let's
it's
put a
hard to point
CSV
to.
of passwords on Russian market or or whatever. I
Yeah.
mean, like,
Right. Like it's I mean, threat researchers know like oftentimes they'll write about a particular threat actor or a threat actor or like a ransomware gang, and usually people affiliated with that gang will like it. They'll repost it. Like, of course, they're going to read things about them. They want to know what people are saying about them, what the people think of them. Obviously, most of these threat actor groups are very reputationally sensitive and
yes,
aware.
yes.
They know that's key to
And
everything.
they might suss out a newcomer coming with something that's just a little bit too good too, because some of those communities, like especially XSS and other ones like that, they're kind of like they shout out. They're like, I don't know about that, because they know
Yeah,
CCI people are in there all the time, right? And they
sure.
it is kind of a game for them to be like spot the Fed on the forum, you know?
Right. Right. Yeah, so I think yeah, you could have pretty immediate response if you wanted to go that way. Most organizations don't. Um, I think if you had a mixed team of people that have some kind of experience, it doesn't have to be years.
Hmm.
But I probably a lot of organizations would be like my experience in industry where a lot of people have different backgrounds. They don't have a background in deception. So what I've found is as you start introducing people to these techniques and these frameworks, once they work through these things themselves, I think that's when they start to pull on their rich experience and their nuance and what they know is plausible or not in very niche places on a network and what's normal in certain network operating environments. That's when you can really get some acute deception, cyber deception that you wouldn't find if you just had someone who has a background in military deception.
Yeah.
You need that kind of merge, right? You need to like naturalize their experience. I've found that so far in industry that can happen. You can take people who don't have background in it, introduce them, train them on it. And that's when they start merging their experience they already have. Then you start having some really interesting demonstrations of deception. And that's what I'm hoping the industry starts to see. I think as people
Hmm.
become more comfortable talking about it, I keep hearing in the past year that a lot more conferences are getting submissions for talks related to deception. Like besides Northern Virginia, they had a bunch of talks that were submitted that were related to cyber deception. A few years ago, that wouldn't have been the case, right? I mean, it would have been like
Hmm.
one or two, maybe. So, yeah, I mean, of course, part of me is like, that's competition for me, but I like that too. That's good. Like, I mean, I, I really think it's a critical part of an organization's security, even if it's just augmenting the network
Yeah.
security. Like it's not the end all be all. It can't be. There's all these other functions for a network, and you've got to trust your network defenders. But that whole comprehensive process should include deception because that can really augment that defense.
You mentioned risk about it, and some organizations being a little bit risk averse when it comes to, this sort of thing. I wanted to ask about some of the, I guess, legal considerations around this. Can you describe some of the things that I guess organizations might want to keep in mind or that surface when running deception operations?
Yeah, of course. I mean, I think the without, I don't have a background in law and I'm not a lawyer, but obviously I've had quite a bit of experience with lawyers and law enforcement. and also lawyers in industry. And generally, any kind of operational precedent that someone can point to could make a big difference in terms of their interpretation of what's possible. I mean, a couple years ago when Amazon put out press release and some feature stories about their Mad Pot and their assistance to law enforcement. That was great for us because we could bring it to our legal team and say, look, even if that's a competitor, look what they're doing.
And
And
what was, can you explain what that was?
oh yeah, so Mad Pot is, given like the massive amount of infrastructure in collection that Amazon has on their infrastructure. It was a honeypot, but it was a honeypot. I'm trying to remember some of the details. Certainly of interest to a certain kind of cyber criminal group. I'm forgetting which one it is as well because there's so many of them out there. But they had used that in support or in partnership with law enforcement to
Mm,
help law enforcement build a case against this cyber criminal group. And so again, not a novel technique, but it was novel that they publicized it. And you can step back and be like, with vendors like that, it's like, sure, their customers or clients include the government. In certain industries, like in retail, they're not usually a client or vendors to the government.
yeah.
So it could be a different space, but that was an important precedent. So I think there's precedent that you can point to. I also think there's norms, there's cultural norms within an organization. So from my own experience at the FBI, you could have different discussions with different people just using different terms, right? If we said this isn't deception per se, it's a ruse. It's a ruse, just like going to someone's house and appearing to be doing a survey, knocking on the door, and the homeowner comes out and like, "Oh, are you so and so?" And like, "Yes, okay." It's a ruse, but maybe that's enough for a law enforcement officer to say, "I verified that they're home," even though I was acting like I was doing a survey. That's still
Mm,
deception. Um, it makes a difference if you're saying I'm doing an influence operation versus psychological warfare, right? All those things do make a difference. I think some differences I've seen that could make a difference in terms of legalities and questions of legality is where that program sits within an organization. My experience in the FBI was that the use of cyber deception, especially from the behavioral analysis unit, which was an operational support unit. So we weren't running the cases, we were just supporting the case agents, and the case agents had the authorities to do those operations. That was the difference. It was on them to make sure they were within those legal authorities. But in terms of an organizational structure, it wasn't really there. There wasn't
yeah.
necessarily updated operational investigative policy that talked about cyber deception.
Yeah.
So you'd have to reframe it differently. And that made a difference because if leaders in an organization don't really understand it and there's not really that policy and procedural foundation, it feels shaky. And
Mm,
typically leadership won't vocalize support for it. And that can cause conflict because you have small deception teams in government that are trying to build awareness and do great things and draw attention internally to it so other people will come to them, but that can cause conflict. In industry, I've seen a different situation where I think cyber deception is much more accepted and understood in like an infosec kind of environment because of the tooling and deception tech that's been out there for a little bit longer, even if people are calling it like active defense and things like that. So if you have an organization that has within their structure a deception team or something like that, now you really have backing. You have an explanation organizationally and
yeah.
approval really for why you have this. And I think what's helpful in terms of legal considerations too is looking at red teams because generally people understand they have an adversarial mindset. Maybe they have different authorities. Maybe they have different permissions and affordances within an organization to do what they do. It's a good roadmap for deception because usually the lawyers in an organization that are looking at that, they're like, well, if this is permissible and we
Yeah.
understand the reason for it, maybe deception's the same because you're still doing deception functions and effects to protect a network, protect personnel, protect your resources in a business value. So there's a lot of similarities there. Absent, discussions about hacking back or things that
Yeah,
mirror too
yeah.
much of like a law enforcement approach. Like we're gonna go on this forum and try to, entice people to get involved in some kind of criminal thing, even if it's benign, and we're just I think a lot of organizations understandably are like, we're not going to go in that direction. We're not a law enforcement agency. But I think if you're talking about defending your network and your organization, I think there's a lot of latitude. I think this just, again, comes down to precedent and pushing that precedent, norms and pushing those norms, and then finding good exemplars like a red team and the function of a red team to be like, it's kind of like this and kind of move in that direction. Because the terminology doesn't always matter so
Yeah.
much. I think it just comes down to what's an organization comfortable with already. And I
Mhm.
think that's where you can find at least a foundation for exploring those legal challenges.
This might be kind of a difficult question, but where do you think organizations can kind of start with deception techniques? I think you might have already given the answer. We're big fans of frameworks and Intel
Yeah.
471 because it kind of imposes order on chaos. Is that where they should start? Is some of the I think you said the Bell-Wharton framework, and then there's
Oh,
also another one. Is that rather than like, oh, you should start with this bit of technology, but maybe rather start with a framework and then think about your own architecture, your own threat landscape, et cetera, et cetera.
sure. Well, oh yeah, so the framework is actually from Bell and Whaley, from Barton
Okay.
Whaley,
Okay.
Bell and Whaley, Bell Whaley framework. I think if you're talking about like how you design things and think about it, um, that's a good framework to start. I think if you're looking for much more immediate practical application, I like Chris Saunders' book, Intrusion Detection Honeypots, because he relies heavily on the see, think, do model. He does talk about Barton Whaley. He does talk about that framework briefly, but I like that. Now, the thing when you look at like John Strand's book on active defense, there's also aspects of that I like as well. My impression of that book, which, is a decade old at this point. So I think for its time and place, it made sense. But a lot of that was focused on tools and techniques to frustrate and annoy
Okay.
attackers. And deception is really so much more than that. There's so much more of a holistic approach that's possible. And I think definitely what's very much unexplored is that messaging aspect, influencing perceptions. Because to me, cyber deception is really about influence. You're trying to influence an attacker, the decisions they make. You're trying to influence attackers, their perceptions of your network and conflict content or infrastructure that they're interacting with. That's what I think it comes down to. But those two resources would be great starting points
Mm-hmm.
if someone's looking for a foundation for how to think about this. I think, even within an industry example, there's training I developed for my cyber deception team that was focused on the Bell-Whaley framework, but the posture or the structure of that course was the think aloud scenario. So you can introduce a simulation technique under the Bell-Whaley framework and define what it is and talk about it. But let's take an example now, right? Like a
Yeah.
cyber criminal is doing A and then B. What kind of technique are you going to use in response to that? What would you build? What would be the deception narrative? I think as people start thinking through that and they have a foundation, that's when you can really start to get creative and explore different applications. We did a paper about a year ago where just as an exercise, I found this used book at a used bookstore on Mujahideen ambushes and raids against the Soviets in the 80s. And I wanted to see if we take examples of raids and ambushes, apply it to the Bell-Whaley deception framework, and then apply it to cyber deception, can we come up with new approaches? And it works very
Huh.
well, right? So you take an example like there was a ambush they would write a lot about where it was past this hotel on this certain highway that Soviet convoys would always have to go through because they needed like the infrastructure for their logistics. And everybody knew Mujahideen will do ambushes here. But there was opportunity to simulate and dissimulate deception because Mujahideen might go to that same hotel and set up weapons, So people would see they're setting up for an ambush, but then they wouldn't ambush. So it's like they were simulating there's going to be
Oh,
an ambush, but then there wasn't. Maybe they ambushed somewhere else, right? Or maybe they don't set up weapons in particular locations at the hotel, so they're dissimulating that there's going to be an ambush, but maybe they ambush somewhere else. But all this comes down to is the attackers are building patterns and demonstrating patterns, and defenders are building and demonstrating patterns. And that's where those behaviors come in, and you want a baseline so you can craft something that's behaviorally responsive to it. But that kind of approach to designing deception can work with almost anything. I mean,
yeah.
I like using analogies for teaching and training deception and then applying it to what you design. So I think there's a lot of application, but those two resources I'd highly recommend as a starting point for people.
Great. I have a final question. It involves AI, of course, because no conversation would be it would be remiss to
Sure.
not mention it. But actually, I mean, AI because generative AI has a lot of conversational abilities, things that could potentially be offloaded from to humans. I mean, what do you think? What's your 10,000 foot view of how AI is going to influence deception?
Well, I think ways it's already being incorporated, right? Like we use it a lot for creating content and using repurposing that content. I think we've come to an interesting place with it where instead of being concerned about something looks fake or it looks like it was generated by AI, we've started to ask the question, if you're not using AI in some form, that's unusual, right? So
Yeah.
if we have content out there and someone's like, it looks fake, it looks like it was generated by AI, we're like, yeah, it should. The other thing I've noticed too is if you look at like blogs and things, blogs are typically indexed more than most content online. And content that's generated from some AI generation platform is great for indexing. If you're looking to like optimize your content, it's great to use that because things are already kind of lined up. That's the way I'd put it. So definitely it does. I mean, I think everyone's aware, like obviously this expedites exponentially content creation and things like that. Again, if you go back to those foundations of how you're designing your deception approach, then obviously that's a major asset. I use it all the time to expedite the creation of content, but
Hmm.
then we want to craft it in a way that we place it in something that still looks authentic. But I think it has great utility. And of course, if it's true that obviously we're starting to see more reporting of like cyber criminals and other threat actors using AI in different
Yes.
functions. Well, people are using that in response too. I think there's a study that came out recently from a team of Israeli researchers, and it was all about them testing their defenses against malicious LLM agents or agentic AI. And what they were finding is even in trained models, models trained to detect attempts to break an LLM with some kind of prompt, it wasn't even over 50% in terms of the detection rate of those LLM agents and being able to detect that stuff. And they often found with a number of strategies that usually you don't even have to do any kind of prompts. You can use disinformation approaches because a lot of these LLM agents different than a lot of people, they exhaust steps and procedures and the instructions they're given, the instructions they consume as they keep rolling through content on the network. So you can use disinformation without prompting to derail those LLM agents. So their research was really interesting. That was very recent. And I'm like, that's promising to me. But it also goes back to this idea again of some of this or a lot of it maybe comes down to perceptions because is an attacker going to approach a target organization differently if they believe this organization uses agentic AI as part of their network defense?
Yeah.
Because now if they're encountering any kind of network processes or systems, and they think it's agentic AI, they probably have to kind of reframe what they think is normal or not. Is this acting like a human or is this acting like an LM? And that can be a great force multiplier for a network defender because again you're coming down to human interpretation or even agentic interpretation of processes on your network because again like that research I mentioned, if LM agents are having a difficult time interpreting the content that they're consuming and processing, and you can manipulate that. This goes back to deception, right? Which is creating erroneous decision making in your target. Well, you can do it against agentic AI as well. So this whole thing with like, what about agentic AI and that being worrisome? I'm not really worried about it. In fact, I think a lot of what we create is kind of based on that kind of framing anyway. Like we want to try and anticipate all the different steps an attacker might want to go through to test things and explore things. That works for an LLM agent as well.
Mm,
The kind of vulnerabilities I want to put on a system that might be a vulnerable honey server or vulnerable web services that would attract an attacker isn't more likely to attract an LLM agent that's
yeah,
malicious. Maybe, maybe. So that doesn't worry me actually. I think it actually has improved my job tremendously. And we can fight that rising use of AI just as well. But I don't think it's going to go away. I think it's like every
yeah,
team's got to have it. I mean, I think even having an AI teammate would probably make sense on a
yeah.
team of an LLM you've refined on your team to perform certain kind of functions. Why not? I mean, I feel like that capability is already there, and that's something I've definitely been exploring.
Terrific.
Yeah.
Well, Tim Papa, thank you so much for joining me. I
Yeah.
appreciate
Thank
it.
you. Yeah. I enjoyed the conversation. Thank you.